Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. Story 1. Officer Carter had been working the night shift for 3 years, and during that time he had responded to hundreds of domestic disturbance calls. Most of them followed a fairly predictable pattern. Neighbors reported shouting or the sound of breaking glass. He would arrive at the location, separate the people involved in the argument, take statements, and, depending on the situation, make an arrest or leave once tempers had calmed down. It was routine work that rarely managed to surprise him anymore. But the call that came through a dispatch at 2:47 in the morning, on a freezing February morning, would destroy every assumption Carter had about what was possible within his line of work. The address was 4738 Millbrook Road, an isolated farmhouse located about 20 minutes outside town. The dispatcher reported that a woman had called 911 saying someone was trying to force their way into her house. She explained that her husband was away on a business trip and that she was alone with her 2 children. The call had been desperate. The woman's voice sounded high-pitched and trembling. Then the line went dead. Dispatch tried calling back several times, but no one answered. Carter confirmed that he was on his way and sped his patrol car down the dark rural roads. When he arrived at the property, everything felt wrong from the very first moment. The long gravel driveway led to a white 2-story farmhouse, surrounded by empty fields. All the lights in the home were on with a bright intensity, illuminating the desolate yard and casting long shadows over the frost-covered grass. The front door was wide open, even though the temperature was below freezing. A family sedan remained parked in the driveway. The hood was cold to the touch. Carter approached slowly, his hand resting on his service weapon as he announced his presence out loud. No one answered. He stepped through the open door and entered the living room. Immediately, he felt the warmth of the heating system running at full power. The television was on, broadcasting a late-night infomercial at low volume. Children's toys were scattered across the carpet, in the middle of what seemed to have been a game suddenly interrupted. A pink stuffed rabbit lay face down near the sofa. Building blocks formed a half-finished tower. On the coffee table was a child's drawing, with the crayons still scattered to one side, as if the little artist had been called away unexpectedly. Carter shouted again, identifying himself as police. The house remained silent, except for the low murmur of the television and the steady hum of warm air coming through the vents. He moved from the living room into the kitchen and found a scene that made his skin crawl. The table was set for dinner with 4 places. 3 plates still contained food, some kind of casserole served with green beans and rolls. The food was still warm. A faint thread of steam was still rising from one of the plates. Beside each place setting were glasses of milk, barely touched. A 4th chair had been knocked backward and remained lying on the floor. The phone hung from its base on the wall, the receiver suspended by the cord and swinging slightly. Carter picked up the receiver and heard only the dial tone. It was the same phone from which the 911 call had been made. His training told him that he needed to check the house room by room to make sure there was no immediate threat before continuing the investigation. He moved through the first floor, inspecting the bathroom, a small office, and the laundry room. Everything was empty. Everything showed signs of having been used recently, but there was no one there. In the office, a computer was still on, with the screen showing a video game paused. In the laundry room, the washing machine had finished its cycle. The wet clothes remained inside, waiting to be moved to the dryer. Upstairs, he found 3 bedrooms. The primary bedroom had an unmade bed and several pieces of clothing spread across the comforter, as if someone had been deciding what to wear. The other 2 smaller rooms clearly belonged to children, a boy and a girl, judging by the decoration. Both were tidy. The beds were made. Everything was in its place. Carter returned to the ground floor and stood in the kitchen, trying to understand what he was seeing. A family had been there less than an hour earlier. They had been eating dinner. The children had been playing. Then something had happened, something that forced them to leave so suddenly that they did not even turn off the lights or close the front door. But the car was still there. The temperature outside was far below freezing. Where could they have gone on foot? And why? That was when Carter noticed the basement door. It was located beside the kitchen, partially hidden behind a pantry cabinet. The door was ajar only a few inches, just enough to reveal the darkness on the other side. Carter had not yet checked the basement. He approached slowly and opened the door completely. A wooden staircase descended into the blackness. The light switch was on the wall at the top of the stairs, but when Carter flipped it, nothing happened. The basement lights did not work. Maybe they had been turned off from below, or maybe the bulbs had burned out. He took the flashlight from his duty belt and aimed it toward the stairs. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing concrete steps leading down to a cement floor. Carter descended cautiously, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The wood creaked beneath his boots. As he went down, the air became colder, much colder than the heated house above. When he reached the last step, he swept the basement with the beam of his flashlight. It was a large unfinished space with concrete walls and exposed wooden beams in the ceiling. Storage boxes were stacked against one wall. In one corner stood an old furnace connected to ducts that branched across the ceiling. Against another wall were a washing machine and a dryer, older models that seemed to serve as backup for the newer equipment upstairs. Everything seemed normal for the basement of a farmhouse. Then Carter heard it. A faint scraping sound, as if something was being dragged across the concrete. It came from the farthest corner of the basement, beyond the reach of his flashlight. Carter identified himself as police again and ordered anyone present to come out and show themselves. The scraping stopped. Silence filled the basement, thick and oppressive. Carter moved forward, sweeping the light across the space. The beam finally fell in the back corner, and then he saw it. A section of the concrete wall had been removed. It was not broken or violently damaged, but carefully dismantled, brick by brick. Behind the wall was a dark opening, a tunnel that went deeper into the earth beneath the house. The tunnel was approximately 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. It had clearly been dug by hand through dirt and clay. Wooden supports had been placed along the sides and overhead to keep it from collapsing. The scraping sound had come from somewhere inside that tunnel. Every instinct in Carter's body screamed at him to call for backup, to get out of that basement and wait for other officers to arrive. But the 911 call had mentioned children. If there was any chance those little ones were down there, he could not simply stand by and wait. He crouched down and entered the tunnel, holding the flashlight in one hand and keeping the other on his weapon. The tunnel extended about 15 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Carter stepped into an underground room roughly 10 by 10 feet, with the same wooden supports holding back the dirt walls. The ceiling was just high enough for him to stand if he hunched over slightly. What he saw inside that chamber would stay with him every day for the rest of his life. The place had been arranged as a livable space. There was a cot with blankets. On an overturned box being used as a table rested a small battery-powered lantern. Empty food containers were piled in one corner. But what completely captured Carter's attention was the wall opposite the entrance. It was covered in photographs. Hundreds of images were pinned to the wooden support beams. They were surveillance photos of the family that lived in the house above. Photos of the mother taking out the trash. Photos of the children playing in the yard. Photos taken through the windows, showing the family eating dinner, watching television, sleeping in their beds. Some of those photographs were dated more than 2 years earlier. At the center of that wall of images was a large hand-drawn map of the inside of the house. Every room was labeled with notes about the family's daily routines. What time they woke up, when the children went to school, when the mother was home alone, the father's business travel schedule. Everything about their lives had been documented with an obsessive level of detail. Beside the map were lists written in tight handwriting, headed by dates. Each list described what the family had done that day, what they had eaten, the clothes they had worn, conversations that had been overheard. Carter realized with horror that someone had been living beneath that house for years, watching the family and recording every aspect of their existence. The tunnel had been dug from somewhere else, probably from an access point far from the home, and had been expanded over a long period of time. Whoever had created it had been patient, methodical, and had remained completely hidden until that night. But where was that person now? And where was the family? Then he heard the scraping sound again, this time closer behind him. Carter spun around and the beam of his flashlight caught movement at the tunnel entrance. A figure was crawling toward him. In the cramped space and poor lighting, Carter could not make out details. He could only see a human shape blocking his only exit. He drew his weapon and shouted orders for the figure to stop and show its hands. The figure kept coming, now faster, moving on hands and knees. Carter made a split-second decision. He could not shoot in that closed space without knowing who he was aiming at. It could have been one of the family members. He moved aside as much as the narrow chamber allowed and directed the flashlight straight at the approaching figure. The beam illuminated the face of a man. Wide eyes, a dirt-covered face, his mouth open in a silent grimace. The man lunged forward and Carter had no choice. He fired twice. The blast was deafening inside the underground chamber. His ears rang as the figure collapsed in the tunnel entrance. Carter immediately called over the radio for backup, surprised that he still had a signal so deep underground. He kept his weapon trained on the body while he waited, watching for any sign of movement. The man was clearly dead. Carter's shots had been accurate at close range. Within minutes that felt like hours, he heard voices in the basement. Other officers had arrived at the scene. They called to him from above and he shouted back, indicating his location. Soon after, the small chamber was filled with officers, crime scene investigators, and emergency personnel. The later investigation revealed the full extent of the horror. The man Carter had shot was identified as a drifter with a history of stalking, trespassing, and unlawful entry in 3 other states. Apparently, he had chosen the farmhouse because of its isolated location and had spent nearly 3 years building the tunnel system in the underground room. The tunnel entrance was located almost 200 yards from the house, hidden inside a drainage culvert on the property. He had been regularly entering the home when the family was away, stealing small objects, moving things out of place, and accessing the computer and phone records. But what had happened on the night of the 911 call remained the mystery that tormented Carter more than anything else he discovered. The family was never found. Not in the tunnels, not on the property, not anywhere in the surrounding area. Despite extensive searches involving dozens of officers and volunteers, no trace appeared. Their car was still in the driveway. Their phones and wallets were still inside the house. No bodies were ever recovered. It was as if they had simply vanished from the kitchen table in the middle of dinner. The prevailing theory was that the stalker had somehow kidnapped them, perhaps with the help of an accomplice who was never identified. But there was no evidence that anyone else had been involved. There were no footprints apart from those of the family and the stalker. There were no tire marks belonging to another vehicle. The mother's 911 call had reported that someone was trying to force their way in, but no sign of forced entry was found in the house. The front door had been opened from the inside, not broken. Whatever happened in those final minutes before Carter arrived remained unexplained. Carter stayed on the force for 2 more years after that night, but the incident changed him irreversibly. He had nightmares about the underground room, about the photographs covering the wall, about the stalker's face illuminated by his flashlight. But worse than all of that was the certainty that he had arrived too late. If he had arrived 10 minutes earlier, 5 minutes earlier, maybe he could have saved that family. 3 people had disappeared, 2 of them children, and despite all his efforts, he had not managed to protect them. He thought about them constantly. He visited the farmhouse several times during the investigation, walking through rooms that still held that family's belongings, frozen in time since the night they disappeared. He attended press conferences where the mother's relatives pleaded for information. He searched databases for any sign that the missing members of the family had been found, hoping for closure that never came. The case technically remained open, but without new leads or evidence of what had really happened, it eventually went cold. Over time, Carter requested a transfer to a desk position. He could no longer continue patrolling without remembering that night every time he responded to a call. He completed the years required to receive his pension and retired early, moving to another state where he could try to build a life that was not dominated by the memory of what he found beneath that farmhouse. But he never managed to fully escape. The case file still remained in some evidence room, gathering dust alongside hundreds of other unsolved mysteries. And somewhere the truth about what happened to that family remains hidden, known only to the force that took them from their home on that freezing February night. Story 2. Detective Thompson had worked the night shift for 8 years, and he was convinced he had already seen every possible type of the domestic violence case. He had gone to apartments where couples screamed at each other over money problems. He had arrested men who, overcome by anger and alcohol, had physically assaulted their partners. He had comforted children who hid trembling inside closets while their parents destroyed the house around them. It was the most terrible part of the job. But Thompson had developed an emotional armor and a methodical way of handling those kinds of situations. Reduce the tension, separate the people involved, document what happened, arrest if necessary. The system was not perfect, but it usually served to stop the immediate violence and give the victims a chance to escape dangerous circumstances. What Thompson did not expect was to respond to a call where the violence had nothing to do with the relationship between the people involved, but with something neither of them seemed able to control. The call came in at 11:43 on a Wednesday night. A desperate woman reported hearing screams coming from the apartment next to hers, apartment 4B, in a low-income housing complex located on the east side of the city. The woman said she had heard a man and a woman arguing loudly for about 10 minutes. Then the argument had turned into screams. After that, she heard sounds of a struggle and something breaking. She called 911 immediately. Thompson and his partner, Officer Rodriguez, were only a few blocks away when they received the report. They arrived at the complex in less than 4 minutes. The apartment building was a 3-story structure that had clearly seen better days. Peeling paint, cracked concrete steps, dim lighting in the hallways. Thompson and Rodriguez entered through the front door and climbed the stairs to the second floor. As they approached apartment 4B, they saw that a small group had gathered in the hallway. 3 neighbors were standing in front of their own doors, drawn by the commotion. An older woman in a bathrobe was pounding on the door of 4B with her fist, shouting for whoever was inside to open up. She was the woman who had called 911. Thompson asked her to step aside and approach the door himself. He knocked firmly, identified himself as police, and ordered anyone inside to open the door. For a moment there was only silence. Then he heard it. A low groan, clearly male, came from inside the apartment. It was the sound of pain, desperate and growing weaker. Thompson knocked again, this time harder, repeating his orders. He received no response except that terrible groan. He looked at Rodriguez and they both understood what they had to do. Someone inside was hurt and needed immediate help. They had enough reason to enter. Rodriguez went to get the battering ram from the patrol car while Thompson continued announcing his presence. The neighbors watched with wide eyes as the 2 officers positioned themselves in front of the door. On the count of 3, Rodriguez swung the ram, and the door burst inward, the frame splintering around the lock. Thompson entered first, his hand on his weapon, though without drawing it, quickly scanning the apartment for threats. What he saw in the small living room left him frozen for a fraction of a second before his training took over. A man lay on his back in the center of the room, motionless. Blood pooled around his head and spread across the worn carpet. Standing over him was a woman in her 30s, dressed in jeans and a white t-shirt that was now splattered with red. Her hands hung at her sides, trembling violently. Her eyes remained fixed on the man on the floor, wide open with shock. Between the woman and the door where Thompson stood was an overturned coffee table and the shattered remains of what had been a lamp. The scene seemed to tell a clear story, a physical fight that had ended in an almost fatal way. Thompson immediately called emergency medical services while Rodriguez approached to secure the woman. He gently took her by the arm and led her away from the body. The woman did not resist. She moved mechanically, as if she were in a trance, allowing herself to be taken to the farthest corner of the room. Thompson knelt beside the man and checked for a pulse. It was there, weak and irregular, but present. The man was still alive. The head wound was serious. Blood continued flowing from a deep cut above his right temple. Thompson applied pressure with his hand while waiting for the paramedics, aware that every second was crucial. Rodriguez asked the woman what had happened. At first, she did not answer. She just kept looking at the injured man with the same expression of shock. Rodriguez repeated the question more firmly. Finally, the woman spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She said the man's name was Marcus. She claimed they did not know each other. According to her, he had knocked on her door about 20 minutes earlier, asking to use her phone because his car had broken down outside. She had let him in. They had been standing in the kitchen while he made the call. Then something had happened. Something had taken hold of him. His entire body had gone rigid. His eyes had rolled back, and he had started speaking in a voice that was not his own. Thompson looked up from the injured man, confused by that statement. Rodriguez asked her to better explain what she meant. The woman said Marcus had turned toward her with his eyes still rolled back, showing only the whites, and had begun saying things in a deep, rough voice. He said that she had to die, that she had been chosen, that it would be quick. Then he had lunged at her, with his hands extended toward her throat. She ran toward the living room, trying to reach the door. He caught her, and they both struggled. Then she grabbed the lamp from the table and swung it at him, hitting him in the head. Marcus fell and hit himself again against the corner of the coffee table as he collapsed. That was the last thing she remembered before the police arrived. Thompson and Rodriguez exchanged glances. The woman's story sounded like an obvious attempt to justify a violent confrontation, claiming that the man had attacked her without provocation and that she had only acted in self-defense. But there were problems with that version. First, if Marcus had really attacked her with the intention of killing her, there should have been marks on her neck or other signs of aggression. From across the room, Thompson could see that the woman's neck showed no visible marks. Second, the neighbors had reported hearing an argument before the violence escalated. If Marcus had suddenly been possessed or suffered some kind of seizure, as she implied, there would not have been time for a prolonged verbal fight. Something in her account did not fit. The paramedics arrived and took over Marcus's care. They placed him on a stretcher and quickly carried him out of the apartment, heading to the nearest trauma center. Thompson knew the head injury was serious enough that Marcus might not survive, and if he died, that scene would become a homicide investigation. He needed to secure the evidence and get a clear statement from the woman before anything else was altered. He informed her that she was being detained for questioning and read her rights. She nodded, dazed, still in that same state of shock. Rodriguez began photographing the scene while Thompson interviewed the neighbors gathered in the hallway. The older woman who had called 911 said she had heard the man and the woman arguing loudly about money. The man was accusing the woman of stealing from him. The woman denied it and told him to leave. The argument had escalated from there, becoming louder and more aggressive, until the sound of furniture breaking was heard. Then came silence, followed by that awful groan. Another neighbor confirmed that sequence, saying the verbal fight had lasted at least 10 minutes before turning physical. This directly contradicted the woman's claim that Marcus had attacked her suddenly and without warning. Thompson returned to her and confronted her with the witness statements. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then tears began running down her face, and she changed her story. She admitted that she and Marcus did know each other. They had been involved in a drug transaction earlier that same day. Marcus said she had paid him less than they had agreed on. He had shown up at her apartment demanding the rest of the money. She did not have it. The argument turned violent when he grabbed her and shoved her against the wall. She defended herself, grabbed the lamp, and hit him harder than she had intended. Everything else, she said, was true. Marcus had fallen and hit his head against the table. She panicked and made up the story that he had attacked her without provocation because she was afraid of being arrested for assault. This new version of events made more sense considering the witness statements, but Thompson still felt that something about the whole situation did not quite add up. He asked the woman to sit on the sofa while Rodriguez continued documenting the scene. While Thompson walked through the apartment looking for anything that might provide more context, he noticed something strange. On the kitchen counter was Marcus's phone. It was still unlocked and showed his recent calls. Thompson picked it up and checked the log. The last call Marcus had made was to someone saved in his contacts as Mom. The call had lasted less than a minute and had been placed at 11:29 at night, approximately 14 minutes before the 911 call. Thompson played the voicemail Marcus's mother had left when she returned his call. Her message sounded desperate. She said she had just received a strange call from Marcus, in which he had not sounded like himself. His voice was different, deeper, and he had said disturbing things that made no sense. She begged him to call her back and tell her he was okay. Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. He checked the time of the message. It had been left at 11:31 p.m., 2 minutes after Marcus called his mother, and at least 10 minutes before the violent confrontation, according to the witness statements. But the woman had said Marcus made a call after arriving at the apartment, which according to her timeline would have happened around 11:25 p.m. If Marcus had called his mother at 11:29 p.m., and she immediately noticed that something was wrong with his voice, that meant something had changed in Marcus during those few minutes inside the apartment, even before the argument truly began. Thompson looked at the woman sitting on the sofa. She was crying silently, her hands clasped together. He asked if she had noticed anything unusual in Marcus's behavior or voice before the fight began. She looked up at him with reddened eyes and slowly nodded. She said yes. Now that he mentioned it, Marcus had seemed strange to her. When he first arrived, he was angry, but he was speaking coherently, complaining about the money in his normal voice. But after calling his mother, something changed. His expression went blank for a moment. Then when he started arguing again, his voice sounded different, lower, rougher. She had thought he was simply becoming more enraged. But looking back on it, that change had been unsettling. That was when he became physical, shoving her with a violence that seemed excessive for an argument over a few hundred. Rodriguez called Thompson over to the coffee table. He had been examining the broken lamp and had found something embedded inside the base. It was a small folded piece of paper yellowed with age that had apparently been hidden inside the hollow interior of the lamp. Rodriguez unfolded it carefully. The paper contained a handwritten note in faded ink. The text was in a language neither of the two officers recognized. They were symbols and characters that vaguely resembled Latin, but not quite. At the bottom of the note was a drawing, a symbol formed by a circle with intersecting lines and strange markings around the perimeter. Thompson photographed the note, folded it again, and placed it in an evidence bag. During the following hours, the investigation moved forward according to normal protocol. The woman was arrested and charged with assault. Her apartment was processed as a crime scene. Statements were taken from all the witnesses. Thompson received word from the hospital that Marcus had died from his injuries at 2:17 in the morning, which elevated the charge to involuntary manslaughter. Everything followed normal procedures, but Thompson could not shake the feeling that there was something more to that case than a simple drug dispute that had ended violently. Over the next few days, he used his free hours to investigate the symbols on the note found inside the base of the lamp. He consulted professors at the local university who specialized in ancient languages and the history of the occult. One of the professors identified the symbols as being related to medieval rituals meant to trap or bind malevolent entities. The professor explained that certain objects were believed to be able to contain or restrict dark forces, and that breaking one of those objects could, in theory, release whatever had been trapped. It was all folklore and superstition, of course, but the professor found it academically interesting that someone had gone to the trouble of creating such a note and hiding it inside a lamp. Thompson thought about the voicemail from Marcus's mother, about the change in his voice. He thought about the woman's description, about Marcus's eyes rolling back and his personality transforming. He thought about the sequence of events, about how the violence had escalated so suddenly after Marcus made that call. And he thought about the lamp shattered on the floor and the old note that had remained hidden inside it for who knew how long. The rational explanation was that Marcus had been under the influence of drugs, that his behavior had been erratic because of substances in his system. The toxicology report would confirm or rule out that theory. When the toxicology results arrived 3 weeks later, they showed that Marcus had no drugs or alcohol in his body at the time of his death. He was completely sober. The medical examiner noted that this was unusual given the circumstances and the criminal history of both people involved. But sometimes people make violent decisions without chemical influence. The case was closed when the woman pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter. She received a 6-year sentence with the possibility of parole after 3. According to the system, justice had been served. But Thompson never forgot the details that did not quite fit. He kept a copy of the photograph of that strange note in his personal files. Sometimes late at night during his shifts, he would take it out and look at those symbols, wondering what they truly meant. He wondered whether there were forces in the world that could not be explained through police work or criminal psychology. He wondered whether Marcus really had been possessed by something evil during the final minutes of his life, something that was released when that lamp broke. And he wondered how many other cases in his career had rational explanations that only served to cover deeper mysteries that humanity was never meant to understand. Years later, Thompson would retire from the force with commendations and an impeccable record, but he never told anyone about his doubts regarding Marcus's case. It was easier to accept the official version, to file it away as another tragic episode of violence between people involved in criminal activity. Thompson learned that some questions were better left unanswered. Some mysteries were meant to remain in the dark, exactly where they belonged. Story 3. Officer Harris had been with the department for 6 years, working patrol and occasionally assisting with support assignments for detectives. When his supervisor approached him to talk about a special project, Harris welcomed the opportunity to change the pace of his usual duties a little. The cold case division needed help organizing its evidence storage room, a cluttered space in the basement that had accumulated decades' worth of files, boxes, and physical evidence related to crimes that had never been solved. The room had fallen into chaos after budget cuts eliminated the position of the clerk responsible for maintaining the cataloging system. Harris was told the project would take several weeks and that he should work on it during the quiet moments of his shift. It seemed like tedious but simple work. He had no idea that he was about to discover something that would bring a dark truth about the department itself to light. The evidence room was exactly as chaotic as he had been warned. Metal shelves covered the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with cardboard boxes of different sizes. Each box was supposed to have a label with a case number, a date, and a brief description of its contents. But many had faded labels or no labels at all. Some shelves contained objects that had simply been stacked there without any kind of organization. Harris's job was to go through everything systematically, confirm that each item matched the database records, and reorganize the room according to proper protocols. It was going to be a long project, but Harris appreciated the quiet of the place compared to the chaos of patrol work. He started in one corner and worked methodically through each shelf. Most of the boxes contained exactly what their labels indicated: evidence from robberies, assault cases, drug arrests. He would open each box, photograph the contents, verify them against the database entry, update the record if necessary, and move on. It was monotonous work, but necessary. The department had recently lost a case because the defense attorney successfully argued that the evidence had been mishandled due to poor documentation. The prosecutor's office wanted to avoid similar problems in future cases, especially in old files that could still be prosecuted if new leads appeared. Harris had been working on the project for 3 days when he found the unlabeled box. It was tucked into the back corner of a lower shelf, hidden behind several properly marked boxes from the late 1990s. The cardboard was old and slightly deteriorated, held together with packing tape that had yellowed with age. It had no case number, no date, no markings of any kind. Harris carefully pulled it out and placed it on his work table. When he opened it, his first thought was that someone had mistakenly stored personal items inside the evidence room. The box contained what looked like keepsakes or belongings saved for sentimental value. There were Polaroid photographs, a spiral notebook, and several small objects, including jewelry and a little girl's hair ribbon. Harris picked up the photographs and began looking through them. His confusion quickly turned into unease. The Polaroid showed women in different locations, Some looked like candid photos taken without the person being photographed knowing. Others showed women who appeared to be unconscious or restrained. The images were disturbing enough for Harris to recognize them immediately as possible evidence in serious crimes. He set the photos aside and opened the notebook. The entries were dated from 1985 to 1998. Each note described surveillance activities, following women, learning their routines, planning opportunities to approach them. The handwriting was neat and methodical, and it described stalking behavior with an almost clinical coldness. Harris felt his stomach turn as he read one entry after another, each one detailing predatory behavior directed at vulnerable women. Some entries ended with phrases such as successful contact made or subject acquired. Harris realized with growing horror that he was reading documentation of a serial predator's activities over more than a decade. He stopped reading immediately and reached for his phone to call his supervisor. That evidence needed to be reviewed by detectives as soon as possible. But then he saw something that froze him in place, phone in hand. At the bottom of each Polaroid photograph was a signature. It was not printed or stamped, but handwritten in blue ink. The signature read, Davis Morrison. Harris knew that name. Officer David Morrison had worked in the department for 30 years before retiring in 2003. He had died of a heart attack in 2011. Harris had never known him personally, but Morrison's photograph hung in the hallway outside the detective's office, alongside other officers who had received commendations during their careers. Morrison had been highly respected, even honored for his work on several high-profile cases during the 1990s. Why would his signature be on photographs that seemed to belong to stalking and assault cases? Harris put down the phone and picked up the notebook again. This time he reviewed the entries more carefully. He cross-checked the dates and descriptions using his phone, searching online for missing persons cases from those years. What he found chilled him. 3 of the women described in detail in the notebook matched descriptions of women who had disappeared in the area during the 1980s and 1990s. The cases had never been solved. The women had simply vanished without a trace. The police at the time had investigated, but they found no leads. The cases remained unsolved and were eventually archived, probably stored somewhere in that same evidence room. Harris spent the next hour comparing more notebook entries with historical files. He found 5 additional women whose disappearances matched the descriptions in the notebook by dates, locations, and physical traits. 8 women in total. 8 unsolved missing persons cases over 13 years. And that box, containing documentation of their surveillance and presumed kidnappings, had been hidden in the evidence room with no case number, no official record, and signed by an officer who had worked on those original investigations. The implications were devastating. Either Officer Morrison had gathered that evidence during legitimate investigations and failed to document it properly, or Morrison himself had been the predator, and that box was his personal collection of trophies. Harris tried to think of innocent explanations. Maybe Morrison had been conducting an unauthorized investigation into a suspect and had kept the evidence separate for some reason. Maybe the box had been filed incorrectly, and the signature was simply Morrison's way of documenting that he had handled the evidence. But none of those explanations held up under careful analysis. There was no reason for an officer to sign his own name on photographs of victims. There was no protocol that justified hiding evidence in an unlabeled box, and the notebook entries were written in the first person, describing the stalking activities as if the writer was committing them, not investigating them. Harris called his supervisor and explained what he had found. In less than an hour, 2 internal affairs detectives arrived at the evidence room. They reviewed the contents of the box while Harris gave a detailed explanation of how he had discovered it. The detectives' expressions grew harder and harder as they examined the photographs and read parts of the notebook. They confiscated the box and ordered Harris not to speak about his discovery with anyone. The matter would be investigated internally before any public disclosure. Over the following weeks, Harris learned through careful and unofficial channels what the investigation had uncovered. Internal affairs detectives had managed to link the objects in the box to 6 of the 8 missing women described in the notebook. The jewelry and the hair ribbon belonged to 2 of the victims. confirmed by relatives who still had photographs where their loved ones appeared wearing those exact same objects. The Polaroids were analyzed and confirmed to be authentic photographs from the corresponding period. The handwriting in the notebook was compared with samples taken from Officer Morrison's personnel file and determined to be a match. The conclusion was unavoidable. Officer David Morrison had been a serial predator who used his position in law enforcement to stalk and kidnap women over a period of at least 13 years. He had kept evidence of his crimes hidden in the department's own evidence room, trusting that the disorganized state of the place would prevent it from being discovered. And he was right for decades. Morrison had retired with full honors, lived his final years as a respected member of the community, and died without ever facing justice for his crimes. The victims' families spent decades wondering what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers, never knowing that the truth was locked inside a box in the basement of the police department. The department faced an impossible decision. Revealing Morrison's crimes would give closure to the victims' families and allow the cases to be officially solved. But it would also expose that a predator had operated inside the department for years without being detected. That would raise questions about supervision, accountability, and how many other officers might have known or suspected something. The scandal would damage public trust and possibly expose the department to lawsuits from the victims' families. After weeks of internal debate, the department made a decision. A press conference was held. The police chief announced that new evidence had been discovered in 6 missing persons investigations belonging to old cases. The evidence pointed to a deceased individual who could not be prosecuted, but whose identity would be revealed to give the families closure. Officer David Morrison's name was made public. His photograph was removed from the hallway of honor. The victims' families were informed privately before the public announcement. Some expressed relief at finally knowing the truth. Others expressed fury because Morrison had escaped justice. All of them filed lawsuits against the department for negligent supervision and for failing to protect the public from a known threat, though the department maintained that Morrison's crimes had been completely unknown until the evidence box was found. Harris completed the evidence room reorganization project over the following months. He found no other hidden boxes or undocumented evidence, but the work lost the feeling of quiet solitude it had had at the beginning. Every box he opened now carried the possibility of containing another terrible secret. He constantly thought about the women whose lives had been taken by someone who was supposed to protect them. He thought about how easy it would have been for Morrison's crimes to never come to light if budget cuts had not made the evidence room reorganization necessary. How many other departments had similar secrets hidden in their basements, waiting to be found? Over time, Harris requested a transfer to another division. He could not keep working in the evidence room knowing what that place had hidden. His supervisor approved the transfer without asking questions, understanding that some discoveries leave permanent marks on those who make them. Harris returned to patrol work, but he was no longer the same. He looked at veteran officers differently, wondering what secrets they might be carrying. He understood that the uniform did not guarantee honor, and that the worst monsters sometimes hid behind badges and oaths. It was a bitter lesson, but also one that made him more determined to become the kind of officer who defended the true meaning of justice, not the corrupted version Morrison had represented. Story 4. Officer Clark had been with the department for 3 years when he first responded to a call at 1847 Ashwood Drive. It was a routine welfare check requested by a concerned neighbor who had not seen the elderly resident of the home for several days. When Clark arrived at the property, he found an abandoned house with boarded-up windows and a front yard covered in weeds. The neighbor who had made the call apologized again and again, saying she must have gotten the address wrong. Clark filed a report stating that the house was unoccupied and did not think about it again. But that was only the first time. Over the next 3 years, Clark would respond to 1847 Ashwood Drive 16 more times, and each visit would become progressively more unsettling, until the final call made him question everything he believed he understood about reality. The second call came 4 months after the first. This time it was a noise complaint. A resident who lived 2 blocks away reported hearing screams coming from the Ashwood Drive address in the middle of the night. Clark was sent with his partner to investigate. They drove slowly down the street with the windows down, listening for any disturbance. When they arrived at 1847 Ashwood Drive, the same abandoned house remained silent and completely dark. They checked the property, found no signs of entry or activity, and concluded that the caller had been mistaken about the exact location of the noise. The third call was for a possible break-in. Someone driving by claimed to have seen flashlight beams moving inside the house. Once again, Clark responded, and once again he found nothing. After the fifth or sixth call, Clark began to notice the pattern. Each report came from a different person and described different concerns, but all of them pointed to 1847 Ashwood Drive as the source of the problem. Domestic disputes, suspicious vehicles, possible intruders, sounds of distress. The calls came at different hours, both day and night, with weeks or even months between them. But the result was always the same. When the police arrived, there was nothing to find. No person, no vehicle, no evidence that anyone had been on the property. Clark mentioned the strange pattern to his sergeant, who reviewed the address history. The record showed that 1847 Ashwood Drive had been the scene of a murder-suicide in October of 2009. A man named Gerald Vance had killed his wife and then taken his own life inside the house. The property was foreclosed on by the bank after spending 2 years on the market without finding buyers. Since then, the home had remained empty, slowly deteriorating while vandals broke in from time to time and the neighborhood declined around it. But there was one strange part. The 911 calls related to that address had begun in 2010, only a few months after the murder-suicide, and had continued regularly for more than a decade. Dozens of calls from different people, all reporting activity in an abandoned house where there should not have been any activity at all. Clark's sergeant suggested that the house had simply earned a reputation in the neighborhood as a place where terrible things had happened, and that residents were hyper-vigilant about any real or imagined noise nearby. People heard sounds coming from other houses and mistakenly attributed them to the infamous murder house. Logically, it made sense, and Clark accepted that explanation. But as he continued responding to calls at 1847 Ashwood Drive, he began to doubt the rational version, because some of those calls did not come from the neighbors. They came from inside the house. The police dispatch system showed the phone number and location of every 911 call. Most came from cell phones with approximate locations based on signal towers. But around the 8th or 9th time, Clark responded to 1847 Ashwood Drive. Several calls appeared as originating from a landline registered exactly to that address. The first time Clark noticed it, he assumed it was a system error. But when it happened again, he asked dispatch to verify it. The operator confirmed that the call came from the landline registered to 1847 Ashwood Drive, a number that had been disconnected by the phone company in 2009. After the murder-suicide. Somehow, calls were being made from a telephone line that did not exist, from a house where no one lived. Clark investigated the phenomenon and discovered that old telephone lines could sometimes cross signals or generate phantom connections, especially in areas with outdated infrastructure. That seemed like a reasonable explanation, until he answered one of those calls himself. It happened on a Tuesday night in November. Clark was patrolling when dispatch reported over the radio that a 911 call had just come in from 1847 Ashwood Drive. The caller had not spoken, but the operator heard background noise before the line disconnected. Clark was only 3 blocks away. He told dispatch he would check it out and arrived at the house in less than 2 minutes. As always, the home was dark and appeared untouched, but this time Clark's instincts told him something was different. He stood in the weed-covered front yard, looking at the boarded-up windows, and felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched. His radio crackled, and dispatch contacted him again. Another 911 call was coming in from the Ashwood address at that very moment, while Clark was standing in front of the house. The operator asked if he could see anyone inside. Clark replied that he could not, but that he was going to investigate. He approached the front door, which was secured with a padlock. All the windows were boarded from the outside with no way to look in. He walked around the perimeter of the house and found no signs of entry. Then his phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for 1847 Ashwood Drive. Clark answered. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then he heard breathing on the other end of the line. Heavy, labored breathing, like someone in danger. Clark identified himself and asked who was calling. The breathing continued. Then a voice spoke, distorted and barely audible. It said his name, Clark. Only his last name spoken in a hoarse whisper. The call disconnected. Clark immediately called for backup over the radio and drew his weapon. If someone was inside that house with access to a phone, then it was an intruder and potentially a threat. But the most troubling part was that the person knew his name. 3 more units arrived within minutes. The officers forced entry through the front door and checked the house room by room with flashlights. The interior was exactly what anyone would expect from an abandoned property. Water damage, peeling wallpaper, trash left behind by squatters and vandals. In the primary bedroom, they found the stains in the carpet where the bodies had been discovered years earlier. But no one was inside. There was no telephone equipment. There was no possible way anyone could have made those calls. The officers conducted a thorough search, checking every closet, every corner, and even the crawl space beneath the house. Nothing. Clark's sergeant ordered a technical investigation. The phone company sent a technician to verify the status of the landline. The technician confirmed that the line for 1847 Ashwood Drive had been permanently disconnected in 2009. The physical cable had been cut at the junction box on the street. There was no possible way that number could place calls, and yet the 911 system record showed multiple calls from that exact number over the last several years, including the ones that had just occurred while officers were on scene. The technician had no explanation for it. Over the following months, the calls from 1847 Ashwood Drive continued. Clark responded every time, and every time he found nothing. But the calls became more disturbing. Sometimes when he answered, his phone would ring from that number, and he would hear background voices, crying, arguments, sounds consistent with a domestic dispute. Once he heard what sounded like a woman screaming, followed by 2 loud blasts like gunshots. Then silence. Every time he raced to the house and found it empty. Clark became obsessed with understanding what was happening. He investigated the history of Gerald and Patricia Vance, the couple who had died in the home. He interviewed neighbors who remembered them. They described an unhappy marriage, frequent arguments, and police calls for domestic conflicts. Gerald had been controlling and abusive. Patricia had tried to leave him several times, but she always returned. On the night of the murder-suicide, neighbors heard shouting, then screams, and then gunshots. Police arrived and found both of them dead. Gerald had shot Patricia in the bedroom and then shot himself. The case had been closed quickly and archived. But Clark discovered something strange in the old files. In the weeks before the murder-suicide, Patricia Vance had called 911 several times, reporting that her husband was threatening her. Each time, police responded and found Gerald calm and cooperative. Patricia withdrew her accusations, saying she had exaggerated. The officers documented the calls but made no arrests. After the murder, there were some internal discussions about whether the department had failed by not protecting Patricia. But in the end, it was determined that the officers had followed proper procedures. There was no way to know Gerald would escalate to murder. Patricia's final call to 911 had happened on the night she died. She told the operator that her husband had a gun and that he was going to kill her. By the time police arrived, they were both already dead. Clark understood that the calls to 1847 Ashwood Drive followed the same pattern as Patricia's calls for help. They were desperate, recurring, and apparently impossible to verify or resolve. It was as if her final moments of terror had left a mark on that house, a psychic echo that kept trying to communicate through disconnected phone lines, begging for help that would never arrive. Clark knew how absurd that sounded. He was a police officer trained to work with facts and evidence, not ghost stories, but he could not deny what he had experienced. The calls were real. The voice saying his name was real. Whatever was happening at 1847 Ashwood Drive went beyond any normal explanation. On his 17th and final response to that address, Clark made a decision. He entered the house alone, without backup and without telling anyone where he was going. He needed to face whatever was inside that home, understand it, or make it stop. He walked through the rooms with his flashlight, calling Patricia Vance by name. He told her he was sorry no one had helped her in time. He told her that her husband could no longer hurt her. The house remained silent. Then his flashlight flickered and went out. In the darkness, he heard footsteps moving across the upstairs floor. He heard a door slam shut. Then he heard that same hoarse breathing from the phone calls, very close behind him in the dark. Clark ran. He left the house, got into his patrol car, and drove away. The next morning, he submitted his transfer request. Clark moved to another district on the other side of the city. He never responded to another call at 1847 Ashwood Drive again. But according to department records, the calls from that address continue to this day. Other officers respond, find nothing, write their reports, and move on. Most of them probably believe it is system failure or neighborhood pranks. But Clark knows the truth. Some places cling to their trauma, repeating their worst moments like recordings that never stop. And some calls for help echo forever, unanswered, waiting for someone brave enough or reckless enough to finally listen. Story 5. Officer Lewis had conducted thousands of traffic stops during his 7 years on patrol. The routine was almost always the same. Lights and siren, get the vehicle to pull over, approach with caution, check license and registration, issue a ticket or a warning, and continue with the shift. Most of those stops were nothing special. Speeding, broken taillights, expired plates. Every now and then, one ended in an arrest for outstanding warrants or drug possession. But even those situations usually followed predictable patterns. Lewis took pride in his ability to read people and assess threats quickly. He trusted his instincts and his training. But nothing in all his experience prepared him for what happened on Highway 9 shortly after midnight on a moonless November night. Lewis was working the night shift, patrolling the rural stretch of highway that connected two small towns. At that hour, there was little traffic, mostly long-haul truckers and the occasional worker returning home after a late shift. He was parked in his usual spot, near mile marker 47, monitoring speed with radar, when a dark sedan passed by at 58 miles per hour in a 55 zone. Technically, it was over the limit, but Lewis normally did not stop anyone for going only 3 miles per hour over. However, when the sedan passed beneath a street light, he noticed that the right taillight was not working. That was a legitimate safety violation. He pulled onto the highway and activated the patrol car's lights. The sedan slowed down immediately and pulled over to the shoulder. It did not try to flee or delay. The driver was cooperating, something Lewis appreciated. He reported the stop to dispatch, giving the plate number and his location. Then he approached the vehicle on the driver's side, with his flashlight in one hand and the other resting near his weapon. Standard procedure. The driver's window rolled down as Lewis approached. Inside was a man who appeared to be in his mid-40s, wearing a button-down shirt and glasses. He had the appearance of an accountant or an office worker. Nothing about him seemed threatening. Lewis introduced himself and explained the reason for the stop. The man nodded and reached for his wallet without being asked. He politely handed over his driver's license. Lewis examined it. The name was Michael Harrison, address in the neighboring county. There were no obvious signs of tampering or forgery. The photograph matched the man behind the wheel. Lewis asked for the vehicle registration and insurance. The man opened the glove compartment and took out the documents, handing them over with the same calm cooperation. Everything seemed completely normal. Lewis returned to his patrol car to run the information through the system. He entered the plate number into the computer and waited for the results. The system took longer than usual to respond, which was not unusual for the old computers in the patrol cars. But when the information finally appeared, Lewis felt the first stab of confusion. The plate number returned no result. It was not listed as suspended. It did not appear as stolen. There was simply nothing. The system did not show any vehicle registered with that plate in any state database. Lewis tried again, carefully entering every number and every letter. The same result. No vehicle found. He then tried the VIN that appeared on the registration document. Again, nothing. The VIN did not exist in any file. Lewis sat inside the patrol car, staring at the computer screen, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A vehicle could not be driven without registration. Every car, truck, or motorcycle had to be registered with some state department of motor vehicles and receive a VIN number during manufacturing. There was no way for a vehicle to simply not exist in the system unless the plates were fake or the VIN had been removed and replaced with an invented number. But the plates and VIN looked legitimate, not homemade or altered. The situation was quickly becoming suspicious. Lewis radioed dispatch and explained what was happening. The operator checked the information from her side and confirmed the same results. No record of the vehicle or the VIN. She asked if he wanted backup. Lewis considered it, but decided to approach the driver first and ask for an explanation before escalating the situation. Maybe there was a simple reason. Maybe the registration had been processed recently and had not appeared in the system yet. He stepped out of the patrol car and walked back toward the sedan, now with his instincts fully alert. As he approached the driver's window again, he aimed his flashlight into the interior of the vehicle to get a better look. The back seat was empty except for a briefcase and a jacket. Nothing out of the ordinary. But when the light moved across the inside of the car, Lewis noticed something that made him stop. The driver's reflection in the rearview mirror did not match the man sitting behind the wheel. The reflection showed someone younger, with different facial features and no glasses. Lewis blinked and looked again. The reflection had returned to normal, matching the driver once more. He convinced himself that it had been a trick of the light or the angle of his flashlight. Lewis asked the driver about the problem with the registration. The man seemed confused and said the car was properly registered, that he had even renewed the paperwork 2 months earlier. His confusion seemed genuine. Lewis asked him to step out of the vehicle. The man obeyed without protesting, opened the door and stood beside the car. Lewis asked if there was anything in the vehicle he needed to know about, weapons, drugs, or illegal items. The man said no. Lewis asked if he could search the vehicle. The man hesitated for a moment and then said yes. Lewis began checking the car while the man remained on the shoulder watching. The front seats revealed nothing strange. Registration and insurance in the glove compartment, a phone charger in the center console, a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder. Lewis moved to the back seat. The briefcase was not locked. Inside were papers, apparently financial documents or work reports. The jacket on the back seat had nothing in its pockets. Lewis was about to end the inspection when he noticed something odd about the rear passenger side door. It was slightly ajar, not fully closed. Lewis had not seen that door open. He looked at the man standing near the front of the vehicle. The driver watched him but said nothing. Lewis opened the rear door completely to check if something was preventing it from closing properly. When the door opened, he looked into the back seat and froze. There was a figure sitting there, a person. Someone had been there the whole time, sitting perfectly still in the shadows, where Lewis had not seen them when he first shined the light through the windows. The figure wore dark clothing and had its head tilted as if asleep. Lewis immediately drew his weapon and ordered the person to show their hands and get out of the vehicle. The figure did not move. Lewis shouted the order again, his heart pounding in his chest. Still, there was no response. He leaned in carefully and touched the figure's shoulder. The instant his hand made contact, the figure collapsed. It fell sideways across the seat, and Lewis realized in horror that it was not a person. It was clothing arranged to look like a human body, stuffed with something that gave it shape. A decoy. But why would someone make a fake passenger? Lewis looked up at the driver, who was still standing calmly beside the front of the car. Their eyes met. The driver smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Lewis ordered the man to get on the ground. The man did not obey. Instead, he turned around and began walking away from the car toward the darkness beyond the edge of the road. Lewis shouted for him to stop. The man kept walking. Lewis ran after him, reaching out to grab his arm. His hand passed through empty air. The man was there. Lewis could see him with absolute clarity, but his hand found nothing solid to hold. He tried again, with the same result. It was as if that man was not physically present, as if he were only an image or a projection. Lewis stepped back while his mind struggled to process what was happening. He aimed his weapon at the figure and shouted orders that received no response. The man stopped walking and turned toward Lewis. Then his appearance began to change. His features transformed, becoming younger and then older, passing through different faces so quickly that it was impossible to follow them. His clothing changed color. His height seemed to shift. Lewis was looking at something that was not human, something that only appeared to be a person. The figure spoke. Its voice was layered, as if several voices were speaking at the same time. It said that Lewis had been chosen to witness it, that the boundaries were thinner there, that others would come. Then it turned around and walked into the darkness beyond the highway, fading from sight within seconds. Lewis stood on the shoulder of Highway 9, breathing hard, his weapon still drawn, staring into the empty night. The sedan was still there with its lights on and the rear door open. The fake passenger remained arranged in the back seat. Lewis called for backup over the radio, his voice trembling as he tried to explain what had just happened. 2 units responded and arrived in about 15 minutes. By the time they appeared, Lewis had already checked the sedan completely. Now there was no driver's license or registration inside the vehicle, even though Lewis was certain he had held those documents in his hands. The glove compartment was empty. The briefcase on the back seat had disappeared. Only the clothing dummy remained, arranged to look like a sleeping passenger. The officers who arrived searched the area, but found no trace of the driver. They documented the abandoned vehicle and called a tow truck. The sedan was impounded and examined by investigators. It was confirmed that the VIN did not exist in any database. The plates were traced and discovered to have been reported stolen from a junkyard 3 states away, 2 years earlier. How the vehicle had been built or where it came from remained a mystery. The clothing used to form the fake passenger was analyzed and determined to be ordinary retail clothing, available in any department store. There were no fingerprints anywhere inside or outside the vehicle, no DNA either, and no traces that could identify whoever had been driving it. Lewis filed an official report describing the traffic stop and the driver's disappearance. He did not include the details about the changing reflection, the impossibility of physically touching the man, or the transformation of his appearance. Those details would have made him sound insane. Even his edited report was received with skepticism. The detective assigned to the investigation suggested that Lewis had been the victim of an elaborate prank, that someone had abandoned the vehicle after seeing the police lights and fled on foot. The fake passenger was explained as a joke or as an attempt to use a carpool lane. Lewis did not argue. He accepted the official interpretation, even though he knew it was wrong. In the following months, Lewis continued working on Highway 9 during the night shift. He conducted traffic stops as usual, following the same procedures he had followed all his life. But now he watched every driver much more carefully. He looked for signs that maybe they were not what they appeared to be. And sometimes late at night, when the highway was empty and dark, he parked near mile marker 47 and watched, hoping to see that sedan. He never saw it again. But on 2 occasions, he saw other vehicles whose plates returned no results when he ran them through the system. Both times he let them pass without stopping them. Some mysteries were better left uninvestigated. Story 6. Detective Walker had spent 12 years working homicide cases, and during that time he had conducted hundreds of interrogations. He had interviewed witnesses who were unable to remember crucial details. He had questioned suspects who lied with practiced ease. He had sat across from killers who showed no remorse, and across from victims' families who demanded a justice he could not always deliver. Walker believed he had developed the ability to read people, to distinguish truth from deception, to understand the psychology of criminals. But nothing in his training or experience prepared him for the interview he would conduct with Raymond Becker, a man sentenced to death who had less than 3 weeks left before his scheduled execution date. Becker had been convicted of murder 12 years earlier. The case had been clear from the beginning. Becker had killed his business partner during an argument over money, shooting him 3 times in the chest inside Becker's office after business hours. Security cameras showed Becker arriving alone at the office building at 9:30 at night. His partner arrived at 9:45 p.m. At 10:17 p.m., Becker was seen leaving the building with a large duffel bag. His partner's body was discovered the next morning by the cleaning staff. Becker was arrested in less than 24 hours. The murder weapon was found in his home. His fingerprints were on the gun. The ballistics matched. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before delivering a guilty verdict. Becker was sentenced to death. For 12 years, Becker maintained that he was innocent, despite the overwhelming amount of evidence against him. He filed appeals that were denied. He gave interviews to reporters claiming he had been framed. His attorneys exhausted every legal avenue trying to overturn the conviction. Nothing worked. The evidence was too strong. The case was too obvious. Becker was going to die for his crime. Then, 3 weeks before the execution date, Becker contacted the district attorney's office with an unusual request. He wanted to speak with a homicide detective about other murders. He claimed to have information about unsolved cases and said he would provide details without asking for anything in return. No deal, no reduced sentence, no stay of execution. He only wanted to confess before he died. Walker was assigned to conduct the interview. The prosecution doubted that Becker had legitimate information. Death row inmates often made false confessions to get attention or try to delay their executions. But procedure required every lead to be investigated, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Walker thoroughly reviewed Becker's file before driving to the state penitentiary where he was being held. He brought recording equipment and detailed knowledge of every unsolved homicide in the region over the last 20 years. If Becker was going to confess to additional murders, Walker would be able to verify whether the confessions were authentic or invented. The prison interview room was small and windowless, with concrete walls painted an institutional gray. A metal table was bolted to the floor with chairs on each side. Becker was brought in wearing an orange uniform and restraints. He was 53 years old, thin and pale after so many years of incarceration. His hair had turned completely gray. He sat across from Walker and waited while the guards removed his handcuffs, though his ankles remained chained to the floor. Walker introduced himself and explained that the conversation was being recorded. Becker nodded and said he understood. Walker began with standard questions. Why did he want to talk now? What information did he have? Becker said he had spent 12 years thinking about his life and the things he had done. He claimed that his execution date had forced him to focus on the need to clear his conscience. He said he was guilty of more than the murder for which he had been convicted. He wanted to confess to 7 additional murders that had never been solved. Walker asked him to describe those crimes. Becker began to speak. The first case he described was that of a woman found dead in her apartment in 1998. Her death had been classified as suicide. She had taken pills and left a note. Becker said it had not been suicide. He claimed he had entered her apartment, forced her to take the pills, and written the note himself, copying her handwriting from documents he found on her desk. He described details of the apartment layout that were correct. He knew about a spare key hidden under a flower pot, something that had never been mentioned in any report. He also described the contents of the suicide note, which had never been made public. Walker felt the first signs of unease. This was not a false confession. Becker knew things only the killer could know. Becker continued describing cases. A man who had drowned in a boating accident in 2001. Becker claimed he had sabotaged the boat. A woman who died in a house fire in 2004. Becker said he had started the fire. Case after case, Becker provided details that matched unsolved deaths, or deaths that had been incorrectly resolved. He described the victims' habits and routines. He knew information from the crime scenes that had never been released to the public. Walker compared everything Becker said with the files, and every detail fit. Becker was confessing to real murders he had actually committed. 7 victims in 3 states over 15 years. 7 families that had never received justice. 7 cases that could now be closed. The interview lasted 4 hours. Walker filled notebook after notebook with details that would have to be verified by other investigators. He arranged follow-up interviews with detectives from other jurisdictions whose cases Becker had confessed to. Everything seemed to be moving exactly as it should. Then, halfway through the recording, something changed. Becker's attitude transformed. His voice, which until that moment had been calm and steady, dropped in tone. It became deeper, rougher, almost guttural. His posture changed. He straightened in the chair, his shoulders firm. His facial expression shifted from resigned to something Walker could not fully identify. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something else, something predatory. Walker noticed the change immediately, but kept asking questions. He asked Becker to describe the 7th victim. Becker began to speak, but the voice coming from his mouth no longer sounded like Becker's. That deep, rough tone continued as he described details of a murder that occurred in 2008. But then Becker began saying things that had nothing to do with the case. He began describing Walker's family. He said Walker's daughter attended Jefferson Elementary School. He said she walked home most days, though sometimes Walker's wife picked her up in her blue Honda. He said Walker's wife liked to shop at the grocery store on Oak Street on Tuesday afternoons. He knew his home address. He described the interior layout of the house. He knew that Walker kept his service weapon in a safe inside the bedroom closet. Walker felt his blood go cold. None of that information was public. Becker had been in prison for 12 years. There was no way he could know anything about Walker's family. Walker had not even been a detective when Becker was arrested. There was no connection between them. Walker asked Becker how he knew all of that. Becker smiled, but it was not Becker's smile. The expression on his face looked wrong, as if someone were wearing a mask that did not fit properly. The voice said it knew everything about Walker. It knew about the case that had gone wrong 3 years earlier. It knew about the evidence that had been mishandled. It knew about the suspect who had walked free because of that mistake. It knew things Walker had never told anyone. Walker stopped the recording. He called the guards to remove Becker from the room. As they escorted him out, Becker turned to look at Walker. His expression had returned to normal. His voice was also his usual voice. He looked confused and asked what had happened, why they were ending the interview. He said he still had more information to give. Walker did not answer. He gathered his notes and recording equipment and left the prison immediately. In his car, he sat for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. He reviewed the recording. The change in Becker's voice was clear in the audio. The impossible knowledge about Walker's family had been documented. Walker reported the incident to his supervisor. Together, they reviewed the recording several times. The supervisor admitted that something unusual had happened, but could not explain it. A psychologist was consulted. She suggested that Becker might be showing symptoms of dissociative identity disorder, in which different personalities emerge under stress. She said it was possible that an alternate personality had access to information Becker's main personality did not consciously remember. Maybe Becker had researched the detectives who might interview him, and his subconscious had retained that information. It was a strained explanation, but it was the only rational interpretation available. Walker requested that someone else complete the follow-up interviews with Becker. His request was denied. He was the lead investigator on the confessions. He had the most complete understanding of the cases. He needed to finish what he had started. Walker returned to the prison 2 days later to continue the interview. This time he brought another detective as a witness. Becker was cooperative and apologized for whatever had happened during the previous session. He said he did not remember saying anything about Walker's family. He seemed sincere. Walker resumed the questions about the murders. Becker provided additional details, locations of evidence that had never been found, explanations of how he had avoided detection, useful and verifiable information. The interview ended without incident. Over the next 2 weeks, Walker coordinated with other law enforcement agencies to verify Becker's confessions. Search warrants were executed. Evidence was recovered. The victims' families were notified. Each confession turned out to be true. Becker had committed the 7 murders exactly as he had described them. The cases were officially closed. Justice was served, though for some families it came 12 years too late. Becker's execution took place as scheduled. He was executed by lethal injection on November 14th at 12:01 in the morning. Walker did not attend. In the months after Becker's execution, Walker kept thinking about that moment inside the interview room when Becker's voice changed and impossible knowledge came out of his mouth. He thought about Becker's stare, about the feeling of watching something that was not entirely human. He thought about how easily Becker had accessed information about his family, information that should have remained private. Walker changed his daily routines. He changed his wife's schedule. He drove his daughter to school himself instead of allowing her to walk. He upgraded his home security system. He moved his service weapon to another place. He took precautions against a threat that rationally should not exist. Becker was dead. The information had been a trick, a coincidence, or something explainable through psychology. But Walker never felt completely safe again. Sometimes late at night, he would wake up with the feeling that someone was watching him. He would check the security cameras at his house and find nothing. He would go check on his sleeping daughter and feel relief when he saw she was safe. Then he would return to bed and remain awake, wondering whether there were things in the world that could not be explained through police work or criminal psychology. Things capable of inhabiting human bodies and speaking through human mouths. Things that knew secrets they should not know. Walker never found answers to those questions. He learned to live with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that some mysteries were deeper than any case file could record. Story 7. Officer Allen had been partnered with Officer Davis for 4 years. They had worked hundreds of shifts together, responding to all kinds of situations, from minor thefts to armed assaults. They knew each other's habits, trusted each other's judgment, and had developed the kind of silent communication that only comes after years of working side by side in dangerous circumstances. That was why when Allen heard the panic in Davis's voice over the radio on the night of October 3rd, 2019, he knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Davis did not panic. He was the calm one, the veteran, the one who had seen everything and still remained steady under pressure. But the voice that came through Allen's radio sounded desperate, barely coherent, and filled with a fear Allen had never heard before in his partner. Davis had been investigating a series of burglaries on the rural outskirts of Cumberland County. Over the past 6 months, 14 homes in the area had been broken into. The pattern was unusual. All the houses were isolated, separated from their neighbors by acres of farmland or woods. The break-ins happened during the day, when the residents were at work. Nothing of major value was ever taken. Small items disappeared. Food from refrigerators, changes of clothing, personal hygiene products. It was as if someone was living in those houses while the owners were away, taking just enough to survive, but not enough to trigger major police investigations. Most of the victims did not even realize their homes had been entered until they gradually noticed several minor items were missing. Davis had developed a theory. He believed the burglar was a homeless person or a transient, someone moving through the county and using empty houses as temporary shelter. Davis had identified several abandoned buildings in the area that could serve as base camps. One of them was the old Cumberland County Hospital, a 3-story structure closed since 2005 due to budget cuts and declining patient numbers. The building had been scheduled for demolition several times, but the project kept being delayed because of funding problems and environmental concerns related to asbestos removal. The hospital remained empty on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a fence and marked with no trespassing signs that vandals and curious teenagers frequently ignored. Davis went to investigate the hospital alone that October night. He did not ask for backup because he did not expect to find anyone. He was simply doing a reconnaissance, checking the building to see if there were signs of recent occupation. Alan was patrolling another section of the county when Davis radioed at 9:47 p.m. that he had arrived at the hospital and was going to take a look around. Alan acknowledged the message and continued his patrol. 23 minutes later, Davis's voice burst over the radio in a transmission that would become a crucial piece of evidence in the later investigation. The communication was broken and difficult to understand. Davis was breathing heavily, almost gasping. His words came out in fragments. He said something about the walls. He said they were watching him. He said someone had been there the whole time. Then the transmission turned into static. Alan immediately responded over the radio, asking Davis to repeat himself and clarify his condition. There was no response. Alan contacted dispatch and reported that Davis was not responding and might be in danger. He gave the location and requested immediate backup. Then he turned his patrol car around and drove at full speed toward the hospital, with the lights and siren cutting through the darkness of the rural roads. Alan arrived at the hospital at 10:18 p.m. Davis's patrol car was parked in the deteriorated parking lot in front of the main entrance. The driver's door was open. The vehicle's lights were still on, and the radio was still transmitting, though no one was speaking. Alan could hear the static and the occasional crackle of the open channel. He drew his weapon and carefully approached the patrol car. The interior was empty. Davis's radio microphone was on the seat, still pressed to transmit. His flashlight was on the dashboard. His hat rested on the passenger seat. But Davis was gone. Alan entered the hospital through the main entrance, which was open. The inside was dark except for the beam of his flashlight. The lobby was full of debris, broken ceiling tiles, and scattered furniture that had been left behind when the hospital closed. The walls were covered in graffiti. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. Alan called out to Davis, and his voice echoed through the empty hallways. He received no answer. He contacted dispatch and reported that Davis was not in his vehicle and that he was going to enter the building to search for him. Dispatch confirmed that support units were on the way. Estimated time of arrival, 8 minutes. Alan moved through the first floor systematically, checking one room after another. Old patient rooms with beds still in place. Examination rooms with equipment that had long since been stripped for parts. A cafeteria with overturned tables. Everything was covered in dust and showed signs of weather damage from broken windows. Alan found no trace of Davis or anyone else. He reached the stairwell and climbed to the second floor. There, the darkness was almost absolute. The beam of his flashlight revealed more abandoned rooms and long hallways stretching into the shadows. He continued calling Davis's name, listening for any sound of movement or response. On the third floor, Alan found the first clear sign that someone was living inside the building. In one of the larger rooms, which may once have been a common area, he discovered evidence of recent occupation. There were sleeping bags arranged on the floor, dozens of them, at least 20 or 30, all placed in neat rows. Food containers and water bottles were stacked against the walls. Clothing hung from improvised lines tied between exposed pipes. Flashlights and battery-powered lamps rested on the windowsills. This was not a temporary shelter for one homeless person. It was a permanent camp for a large group. Alan reported his discovery to dispatch just as he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around, raising his flashlight and weapon. A figure stood in the doorway, partially hidden by shadow. Alan ordered the person to show their hands and identify themselves. The figure stepped into the light. It was a man in his 40s, dressed in dirty clothes and carrying a backpack. He slowly raised his hands. Alan asked him where Davis was. The man replied that he did not know anyone named Davis. Alan asked how many people were living in the hospital. The man hesitated and then said there were others. Many others. They had been living there for months, moving through the condemned buildings of the county, staying ahead of demolition schedules and police patrols. They were squatters, homeless people who had formed a community in the abandoned spaces no one else wanted. Alan heard more footsteps. Other people began emerging from the shadows of the hallways, drawn by the voices and the flashlight beam. In less than a minute, Alan was surrounded by 15 people, all wearing worn clothing, all watching him with cautious expressions. Alan kept his weapon drawn, but did not aim it at anyone in particular. He asked about Davis again. An older woman in the group spoke. She said a police officer had passed through earlier. They had hidden when they heard him approaching. They had watched him from inside the walls. The building had service corridors and access spaces behind the patient rooms, old maintenance passages that allowed people to move through the hospital without being seen. They had used those passages to avoid detection while Davis checked the floors. But Davis had discovered one of the access panels and had gone into the walls to investigate. They had heard him moving inside. Then they heard him talking over the radio. After that, silence. Alan demanded that they show him where Davis had entered the walls. The group led him back to the second floor to a patient room where a wall panel had been removed. Behind the panel was a narrow passage that ran parallel to the main corridor. Alan crawled inside with his flashlight, his radio, and his weapon. The passage was barely wide enough for him to move forward. It was completely dark except for the light of his flashlight. He could see footprints in the thick layer of dust on the floor, fresh footprints leading deeper into the passage. He followed them. The corridor opened into a wider maintenance hallway connected to a service staircase. Alan went down the steps, following the footprints. At the bottom, he found a basement level that did not appear on any of the building plans he had seen. The basement was a maze of storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and tunnels connecting different parts of the hospital complex. Alan's radio barely worked that deep underground. Only occasional bursts of static came through. He continued following the footprints until he found Davis. Davis was sitting in a small mechanical room, his back against a wall. His flashlight had gone out. He was holding his radio, but he was not transmitting. When Alan's flashlight beam reached him, Davis looked up with an expression of deep relief. He was not injured, but he was clearly shaken. Alan helped him to his feet, and together they made their way back through the tunnels toward the main building. As they climbed the stairs back to the second floor, Davis explained what had happened. He had been following the passages inside the walls when his flashlight failed. He became disoriented in the darkness and could not find his way back. He tried calling for help over the radio, but the signal would not transmit from inside the walls. He sat down to conserve his phone battery and wait for rescue, knowing Alan would come looking for him. By the time Alan and Davis left the building, backup had already arrived. There were 6 patrol cars in the parking lot, along with an ambulance. The squatters who had been living in the hospital were detained and questioned. Their identities were documented. Social services were called to offer them assistance. The burglary investigation moved quickly once the squatters were identified. 3 of them admitted to entering houses during the day to take supplies. They said they had not intended to scare anyone or hurt anyone. They were only trying to survive. They were arrested and charged with multiple counts of burglary. The other members of the group were offered shelter through county assistance programs. Most refused the help and moved elsewhere. The hospital was secured and scheduled for immediate demolition. In less than 6 months, it was reduced to rubble and the land was cleared. The burglary case was closed with arrests and convictions. Davis received a commendation for the investigative work that led to identifying those responsible. Alan received recognition for successfully rescuing his partner. From an official perspective, everything ended well. Justice was served. The community was safer. 2 officers had performed their duties with distinction, but the incident left a permanent mark on Alan and Davis. Their relationship as partners was never exactly the same after that night. Davis had experienced something in those dark passages that he almost never talked about. The feeling of being watched by dozens of eyes he could not see. The knowledge that people had been living in secret, in plain sight, for months without being detected. The vulnerability of getting lost and becoming helpless in the darkness beneath an abandoned building. Alan understood because he had felt it too while crawling through those passages in search of his partner. That feeling that the world contained hidden spaces where some people existed outside normal society, invisible and unknown until circumstances forced them into the light. It was unsettling on a fundamental level, something that had nothing to do with danger or violence, but with the realization that reality was less stable and less easy to know than they had both believed.